The old grandfather clock in the hall chimed 7, each strike echoing through the cold, marble expanse of Blackwood Manor. From her seat in the upstairs drawing room, Lady Eleanor Ainsworth, Duchess of Blackwood, heard the sound. It was a sound she had known her entire married life, a steady and reliable measure of time in a house that felt increasingly timeless and still. She smoothed a non-existent crease in her emerald silk gown, the fabric cool against her skin. Down below, the crunch of carriage wheels on the gravel driveway broke the evening's quiet. He was late, as usual. Eleanor did not rise. She simply tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the tall window that overlooked the main entrance. For a moment, she allowed herself to feel the familiar, weary ache of disappointment. It was a dull throb now, not the sharp agony it had once been. Her husband, Alistair Ainsworth, Duke of Blackwood, moved through life on a tide of his own making, and punctuality was a courtesy he rarely extended to his own wife. The carriage door opened, and Alistair stepped out. Even from this distance, she could see the confident, careless set of his shoulders. He was handsome, she had to admit, in the way a marble statue is handsome. Perfect in form, but utterly cold to the touch. He turned back to the carriage, his hand extended. This was unusual. He never bothered with such pleasantries for her. A smaller figure emerged, a woman wrapped in a traveling cloak too bright for the fading light. Eleanor leaned forward slightly, her fingers tightening on the arm of her chair. The woman stepped into the full view of the porch light, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. She was young, with a cascade of blonde hair, and she was unmistakably, profoundly pregnant. The swell of her belly was visible even beneath the heavy cloak. A coldness, sharper and more terrifying than the evening chill, spread through Eleanor's limbs. This was not a rumor anymore. It was not a whispered tale from a concerned friend in London or a vague item in a society gossip column. It was here, on her doorstep. Her breath caught in her throat, a tiny, sharp sound that was swallowed by the cavernous room. She felt the blood drain from her face. For one wild second, she wanted to flee, to run to the back of the house and lock herself in her rooms until this nightmare went away. But she was the Duchess of Blackwood, and a duchess does not run. Slowly, deliberately, she stood up. She walked to the large gilded mirror that hung above the fireplace. Her reflection stared back, a woman with auburn hair pinned in a severe but elegant chignon. Her green eyes were wide, betraying the shock she fought so hard to conceal. Her face was a pale oval in the dim light. She took a deep breath, watching her own chest rise and fall. Composure, she told herself. Composure is a shield. She placed a hand over her racing heart, a gesture of self-reassurance, then let it drop. Her expression settled into a familiar mask of cool, aristocratic neutrality. She was ready. As she descended the grand, curving staircase, the scent of beeswax and the faint, funereal perfume of week-old lilies filled the air. The staff, usually invisible and silent, seemed to hold their collective breath. She saw a housemaid dart behind a pillar, her eyes wide with curiosity and fear. The butler, Jennings, stood ramrod straight by the main door, his face a stony mask of disapproval. He had served her family before she was married, and his loyalty was to her, a fact Alistair deeply resented. Alistair was in the center of the hall, shrugging off his coat. The young woman stood beside him, looking up at the vaulted ceilings and the stern portraits of past Ainsworth dukes with a wide-eyed, almost greedy wonder. She had a doll-like prettiness, a youthful bloom that felt jarringly out of place in the ancient, somber hall. "Ah, Eleanor," Alistair said, his voice booming with false cheer. He turned, a brilliant smile on his lips that never reached his cold blue eyes. "I trust you weren't waiting long." Eleanor stopped on the final step, her hand resting lightly on the polished mahogany banister. She was taller than the other woman, and she used the height to her advantage. She let her gaze travel from her husband to his guest, a slow, deliberate assessment that was more insulting than any glare. "Alistair," she said, her voice perfectly even, "you have brought a guest." "Indeed," he replied, draping an arm around the young woman's shoulders in a gesture of blatant possession. The woman Clara preened under his touch. "Eleanor, my dear, this is Miss Clara Bellwether. Clara, my wife, the Duchess." "Your Grace," Clara murmured, executing a small, clumsy curtsy. Her eyes were bright with a mixture of awe and defiance. She was looking at the woman whose place she had evidently come to take. Eleanor felt a fresh wave of nausea. He had brought his mistress into their home, not for a clandestine visit, but as a guest to be introduced. The sheer audacity of it was breathtaking. It was a declaration of war, delivered on her own territory. "Miss Bellwether," Eleanor said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "Welcome to Blackwood Manor." She did not offer a hand, she did not smile. She simply acknowledged her existence with the barest minimum of courtesy, a cold dismissal that was far more powerful than a show of anger. Alistair's smile tightened. He had expected tears, a scene, a hysterical outburst. Her icy control infuriated him. "Clara will be staying with us," he announced, his tone daring her to object. "Her condition requires rest and quiet, and where better for that than the countryside?" The lie was so thin, it was transparent. Their guests for dinner were due to arrive at any moment. The house was prepared for a formal party, not a quiet convalescence. The cruelty was the point. He wanted to humiliate her, not just in private, but publicly. Eleanor's mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to order this woman out of her house, to unleash the fury that was coiling in her gut like a serpent. But she saw the trap. If she caused a scene, he would paint her as the shrewish, jealous wife. He would be the long-suffering husband, merely trying to do the right thing by a poor, expectant mother. She would be the villain. No, she would not give him that satisfaction. "Of course," she said, her voice as smooth as ice. "The staff will have a room prepared. I'm sure you will find everything you need." She turned her gaze to the butler. "Jennings, please see to it that the Rose Room is made ready for Miss Bellwether." The Rose Room was in the far east wing. It was pleasant, but it was miles away from the family's main quarters, a room for a distant cousin or a governess. It was a subtle but clear message. Jennings bowed his head. "At once, Your Grace." Clara's face fell slightly, a flicker of disappointment crossing her features. She had likely imagined a suite of rooms adjacent to the Duke's. Alistair shot Eleanor a look of pure venom, but he could not fault the instruction. She was playing the role of the perfect, accommodating Duchess. Just then, the sound of another carriage arrived. The Barringtons. Lord and Lady Barrington were old friends of Alistair's family, fixtures of the county, their opinions carrying immense weight. "Our guests," Eleanor said calmly, as if nothing were amiss. "We should not keep them waiting." She swept past Alistair and Clara, moving towards the drawing room where the party would assemble. She did not look back. She could feel their eyes on her, but she kept walking, her spine a rod of steel. Each step was an act of defiance. Each breath was a silent vow that she would not break. The dinner was an exquisite torture. Eleanor sat at the head of the long, gleaming mahogany table, a queen presiding over a court of simmering disaster. To her right sat Lord Barrington, a portly man with a booming laugh that sounded increasingly forced as the evening wore on. Opposite him, Alistair had placed Clara Bellwether. The seat of honor, traditionally reserved for the highest-ranking female guest, was now occupied by her husband's pregnant mistress. The insult was so profound, so utterly without precedent, that the other guests seemed to be in a state of collective shock. Lady Barrington and Mrs. Fairfax, seated further down the table, exchanged tiny, horrified glances over their wine glasses. They spoke in hushed, brittle tones, their conversations circling aimlessly around the weather, the gardens, the latest London plays. Anything to avoid the glaring reality of the woman seated amongst them. Eleanor played her part with masterful precision. She guided the conversation, her voice a calm and steady presence in the sea of awkwardness. "Lord Barrington, Alistair tells me your new hunter took first prize at the county show," she would say, her smile never faltering. She was the perfect hostess, her composure an impenetrable fortress. But inside, she was crumbling. Her mind kept replaying the moment Clara had walked into the hall, the triumph in her youthful eyes, the possessive way Alistair had put his arm around her. Every bite of food tasted like cardboard. The fine Bordeaux, a vintage from her own father's cellars, was acid in her throat. She focused on the physical sensations to keep herself grounded, the weight of the heavy silver fork in her hand, the stiff lace at her cuffs, the cool draft that whispered from the tall, mullioned windows. Across the table, Alistair was holding court. He was expansive, charming, refilling Clara's water glass with a solicitous air. He lavished attention on her, telling an amusing anecdote and then turning to her with a fond smile. "Isn't that right, my dear?" Clara, growing in confidence with every passing moment and every glass of wine Alistair drank, would giggle and agree. She was wearing a dress of bright yellow, a jarring splash of color against the dark wood and somber tapestries of the dining hall. She looked like a common wildflower that had somehow sprouted in the middle of a formal garden. Eleanor felt the gazes of the ancestors on her. Their portraits lined the walls, a gallery of stern-faced men and women who had built and maintained the Blackwood name for 300 years. She felt their judgment, their disappointment. She, Lady Eleanor Ainsworth, had brought a vast fortune into this marriage, saving the debt-ridden estate from collapse. And this was her reward, to be publicly shamed at her own table. A cold, hard anger began to crystallize in her chest, displacing the initial shock and pain. It was a different kind of anger than she had ever felt before. Not hot and volatile, but cold and sharp, like a shard of ice. She looked at Alistair, truly looked at him, as if for the first time. She saw the weakness behind his arrogance, the insecurity that fueled his cruelty. He was a man propped up by a title he hadn't earned and a fortune he hadn't made. Her fortune. And he was using it to destroy her. The main course was cleared away in near silence. The servants moved with a quiet, ghost-like efficiency, their eyes downcast. The tension in the room was so thick it felt as if it had a physical weight. Lord Barrington cleared his throat, preparing to make another attempt at polite conversation, when Alistair tapped his knife against his crystal glass. The sharp, ringing sound cut through the silence, making everyone jump. Alistair stood up, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. He held his wine glass aloft. "My dear friends," he began, his voice resonating with theatrical importance, "I have an announcement." Eleanor's hand, which had been resting on the table, moved to grip the stem of her own wine glass. Her knuckles turned white. She knew with a dreadful certainty what was coming. This was the final brutal stroke. "As you can all see," Alistair continued, gesturing grandly towards Clara, "we are to be blessed with a new arrival at Blackwood." A collective strangled gasp went around the table. Lady Barrington's fan froze mid-flutter. Clara looked down at her lap, a picture of blushing modesty, but Eleanor could see the triumphant smile she was trying to hide. "Miss Bellwether has been through a great deal," Alistair said, his voice dripping with false sincerity, "and I have decided that she and the child will be best cared for here. Blackwood is, after all, a family home, and it is my duty to provide for my family." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, thick and poisonous. He looked directly at Eleanor, his eyes glinting with malice. "And so I am pleased to announce that Miss Bellwether will not be a guest. She will be making her home here with us, permanently." Silence. A profound, absolute silence that seemed to suck all the air from the room. The ticking of the clock in the hall was suddenly deafening. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean in closer. Eleanor felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, the guests, the servants, the ghosts of ancestors. They were all watching, waiting for her to shatter. Her fingers were locked around the delicate stem of her glass. She felt the cool, smooth crystal against her skin and focused on it. It was the only solid thing in a world that was dissolving into chaos. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. Her vision narrowed until all she could see was the deep red of the wine, swirling like blood in the candlelight. She could feel a single hot tear threatening to spill over, but she refused it. She would not cry. Not here. Not in front of him. She imagined the glass shattering in her hand, the shards biting into her palm, the pain a welcome distraction from the agony in her soul. But she did not squeeze. She held it steady. With a monumental effort of will, she raised her head and met her husband's triumphant gaze. She allowed no emotion to show on her face. She simply looked at him, her green eyes as cold and clear as chips of ice. It was Lord Barrington who finally broke the spell. He pushed his chair seat abruptly, the legs scraping loudly on the polished floor. "My dear," he said to his wife, his voice strained, "it is getting late. We have a long journey." Lady Barrington was already on her feet, gathering her shawl. "Yes, of course," she stammered, not daring to look at Eleanor. "Thank you for a lovely evening, Your Grace." It was a signal for a general retreat. The Fairfaxes quickly followed suit, mumbling their own hasty excuses. The departure was a flurry of awkward movements and averted eyes. No one knew what to say. They offered Eleanor brief, pitying glances before hurrying out into the night, as if fleeing the scene of a terrible accident. They left behind the smell of cold food and extinguished hope. Soon the vast dining hall was empty, save for the three of them. The long table looked like a battlefield, littered with discarded napkins and half-empty glasses. The candles had burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Eleanor remained seated, her hand still around her wine glass. She had not moved. Alistair walked slowly around the table until he stood behind her. He leaned down, his voice a low, mocking whisper in her ear. "I trust you will make our new resident feel welcome, my dear." She did not flinch, she did not turn. She continued to stare straight ahead at the flickering candle flame. Alistair straightened up with a soft, cruel laugh. He walked over to Clara, who was now standing uncertainly by her chair. "Come, my dear," he said softly, offering her his arm. "Let me show you to your rooms. You must be exhausted." Clara took his arm, casting one last, fleeting look at the silent Duchess. It was a look of victory, but it was tinged with a flicker of something else. Perhaps fear. She was a pawn in a game far more complex and dangerous than she understood. Alistair led her from the room. Eleanor listened to their footsteps crossing the marble hall. She heard them begin to ascend the grand staircase. His confident tread, her lighter, more hesitant one. The sounds grew fainter and fainter until they were gone completely. And then there was only silence. A deep, profound silence that filled the enormous house. Eleanor Ainsworth, Duchess of Blackwood, was utterly alone in the cavernous dining hall. The dying candlelight flickered across her pale, still face. A single, perfect tear finally escaped and traced a slow, cold path down her cheek. The great clock in the hall struck 11, each chime echoing through the silent manor like a judgment. Eleanor stood alone in the vast dining hall, a solitary figure amidst the wreckage of the evening. The scent of withered flowers and abandoned wine hung heavy in the air. Servants moved like ghosts at the edge of her vision, clearing away the evidence of a dinner party that had died before it was finished. Her own glass, the one she had gripped so tightly, sat on the polished table, a perfect blood-red circle on the white linen. She didn't look at it. Her gaze was fixed on the grand staircase, the path her husband had taken with that girl. Her heart was not pounding. It was a cold, heavy stone in her chest. The initial shock, the hot surge of shame that had burned her cheeks, had receded. In its place was something chillingly clear. For 10 years she had played her part, the dutiful duchess, the gracious hostess, the silent financier of a life she was allowed to observe but not truly inhabit. Tonight, Alistair had not just broken their vows. He had set them on fire for the entire world to see. She pushed herself away from the table, her silk dress rustling in the oppressive quiet. Each step on the marble floor was a deliberate, measured click. She was not walking towards her own chambers, to the cold comfort of her solitary bed. She was walking towards his study, the den where the Duke of Blackwood conducted his affairs, managed his estate into ruin, and retreated from a wife whose intelligence he found inconvenient. The journey down the long, portrait-lined corridor felt different tonight. The painted eyes of his ancestors, the stern-faced Ainsworths of generations past seemed to follow her with a mixture of pity and accusation. She ignored them. They were part of his world, his history, his entitlement, a history he was currently defiling. The door to the study was thick, dark oak. She did not knock. Her hand closed over the cold brass knob and turned. The latch gave way with a heavy thud, and she pushed the door open. Alistair was standing by the fireplace, swirling a measure of brandy in a crystal tumbler. The fire cast flickering shadows across the room, making the taxidermy stag on the wall seem to watch with lifeless eyes. The air was thick with the masculine scents of old leather, cigar smoke, and spirits. He looked up as she entered, not with surprise, but with a lazy, arrogant amusement. A faint smile played on his lips. "Eleanor," he said, his voice smooth and condescending. "I thought you would have retired. The evening was, I imagine, rather tiring for you." She closed the door behind her, the sounds sealing them in. She walked towards the center of the room, stopping before his enormous mahogany desk. It was a fortress of a desk, littered with unopened letters and sporting journals. She placed her hands flat on its cool, polished surface to steady herself. "She has to leave, Alistair," she said. Her voice was low, devoid of the tremor she felt deep inside. It was a simple statement of fact. Alistair took a slow sip of his brandy, his eyes never leaving hers over the rim of the glass. He let the silence stretch, enjoying it. He enjoyed her standing there, forced to confront him in his own sanctuary. "Clara?" he finally asked, a note of feigned innocence in his tone. "Leave, but she has only just arrived. It would be terribly rude to send her away so soon." He chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that grated on her nerves. "Besides, in her condition, travel is not advised." "Her condition is precisely why she cannot be here," Eleanor stated, her fingers pressing harder into the wood. "This is our home. This is Blackwood Manor. Have you forgotten what that means? The name, the title you carry?" He set his glass down on the mantelpiece with a decisive clink. He turned to face her fully, leaning back against the stone. The firelight glinted off the heavy gold of the Ainsworth ducal signet ring on his finger. "On the contrary, my dear, I have forgotten nothing," he said, his voice losing its lazy drawl and taking on a sharper edge. "I am the Duke of Blackwood, and this is my house. I decide who resides under its roof, not you." The bluntness of it was like a slap. She had expected denials, excuses, perhaps even a half-hearted promise to be more discreet. She had not expected this open, shameless declaration of power. "And the scandal, Alistair? Do you think our friends, our society, will simply overlook this? You have brought your pregnant mistress into your marital home. You have humiliated me in a way that cannot be undone." He laughed then. It was not a pleasant sound. It was a harsh, barking laugh filled with genuine mirth at her naivety. He pushed himself off the mantelpiece and walked toward her, circling the desk until he stood beside her. He was taller than she was, and he used his height to loom over her. "Scandal?" he scoffed, leaning close. She could smell the brandy on his breath. "Oh, Eleanor, you still think in such simple terms. A scandal only has power if one is afraid of it." "I am not," he paused, letting his words sink in. "But you should be." She turned her head to look at him, her expression a mask of cold fury. "What is that supposed to mean?" "It means," he said, tapping a finger on the desk right next to her hand, "that the real scandal would be the Duchess of Blackwood abandoning her husband. A woman of your standing, of your breeding, creating such a scene, fleeing her home. That would be a delicious story for the papers, would it not? The proud, wealthy Duchess, unable to hold her husband's attention, running away in a fit of pique." Her blood ran cold. He was twisting it, turning her own dignity into a weapon to be used against her. Leaving him would not make her a wronged wife in the eyes of the world he painted. It would make her a failure. "I would not be fleeing," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. "I would be leaving a situation that is untenable. Any sane person would understand." "Perhaps," he conceded with a dismissive wave of his hand, "but understanding does not pay the bills. Where would you go, Eleanor? A hotel? Rented rooms in London? How long before your pride could stomach that? You are the Duchess of Blackwood. Your identity is tied to this house, to me. Away from all this," he gestured around the grand, shadowed study, "you are just a rich woman with a sad story. Here, you are a duchess. You would be giving up everything." The cage he was building around her was becoming clearer. It was not made of iron bars, but of public perception, social standing, and her own pride. He knew her so well. He knew her fear of being pitied, of being seen as a victim. "I have my own fortunes," she said, the words feeling like ash in her mouth. It was a truth she had clung to for years, her one piece of independence. Alistair's smile returned, wider and more predatory than before. This was the point he had been waiting for. This was the heart of the matter. "Ah, yes, your fortune," he purred, "the great sterling inheritance, so carefully locked away in its trust, untouchable, by me at least." He leaned in again, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But not by you. And that, my dear wife, is the most beautiful part of this whole arrangement." She stared at him, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. "What arrangement?" The one we are in now, he said, straightening up and walking back to the fire as if explaining a simple business transaction. Clara is a simple girl. She has simple needs, but she is carrying my child. A son, I hope. And children, as you know, are expensive. Schools, clothes, ponies, the lifestyle to which an Ainsworth heir is entitled. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. He was not just acknowledging the child, he was planning its future, a future paid for by her. You cannot be serious, she whispered, the words catching in her throat. I have never been more serious in my life, he replied, turning back to her, his face stripped of all charm. All that remained was a cold, calculating greed. This estate, this title, it runs on fumes, Eleanor. You know that. My creditors are becoming impatient. Your annual contributions are a balm, but they are not a cure. We need more. We, she repeated, the word tasting like poison. Yes, we, he affirmed. You and I, this family. Clara and the baby are now part of this family, and they must be provided for. Your fortune is more than adequate to ensure their comfort, to ensure my comfort, to ensure the wolves are kept from the door. The sheer audacity of it stole her breath. He was not asking. He was informing her of the new terms of their marriage. She was to be the silent partner who funded his infidelity. She was to pay for the upkeep of the woman who had replaced her and the child who would usurp any hope she had for her own. And what if I refuse? She asked, her voice shaking with a rage so profound it felt like a physical illness. What if I tell you to take your mistress and your debts and go to hell? Alistair simply smiled. It was a calm, confident expression that terrified her more than any shouting would have. Then you are welcome to leave, he said smoothly. But you will cause the scandal I spoke of. You will be the talk of every drawing room and gossip column from here to London. And he picked up his glass again, I will be the poor, abandoned husband left with a mountain of debt and a child on the way. The estate will collapse. The name will be dragged through the mud. Everything your father's money was meant to preserve when he married you to me will be destroyed. Is that what you want, Eleanor? To see your inheritance burn just to spite me? To tear down this house because you can no longer be its queen? He had thought of everything. He had laid the trap with meticulous, cruel precision. He believed her love for the status, for the name, and her fear of public disgrace were stronger than her self-respect. For years, perhaps, he had been right. She looked at his handsome, smug face, and the last vestiges of the man she thought she had married crumbled to dust. The love she had once felt, the hope she had nurtured in the lonely silence of this grand house, it all curdled into something hard and cold. He did not see a wife. He saw a solution to a financial problem. A bank, an asset. She felt nothing. A vast, empty calm settled over her. The rage was still there, but it was no longer a hot, blinding fire. It was ice. It was a glacier, moving slowly but with unstoppable force, grinding everything in its path to dust. He thought he had trapped her. He thought her money was his salvation. He had no idea that he had just handed her the very weapon she would use to destroy him. He had mistaken her silence for weakness, her composure for surrender. Eleanor straightened her shoulders. She lifted her hands from the desk, turning away from him without another glance. Her silence was her answer. There were no more words to be said. Arguing was beneath her. Pleading was unthinkable. He had laid out the terms of war, and she had accepted. She walked toward the door, her back ramrod straight. She could feel his eyes on her, confident and victorious. He probably thought she was retreating to her room to weep. He probably thought he had won. The thought brought a flicker of something dark and sharp into her mind. Eleanor? He called after her, a touch of mocking concern in his voice. Are you all right? She did not turn. She did not pause. She simply opened the heavy oak door and stepped out into the hallway, pulling it shut behind her. The click of the latch was final. It was the sound of a line being crossed, a door being closed on a life she would never lead again. Eleanor walked away without another word, her face a pale, unreadable mask, but her mind was racing. The heavy oak door of her bedroom clicked shut. The sound echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence of the room. For a moment, Eleanor did not move. She stood with her back pressed against the wood, her hands flat against the cold, carved surface. Her entire body was a single, rigid line of defiance. She could still feel the phantom weight of Alistair's condescending gaze on her, hear the echo of his laughter in the hall. He had dared her. He had taunted her with her own powerlessness, confident that her fear of scandal was a chain he could pull anytime he wished. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. The tightly laced corset, usually a familiar source of posture and poise, now felt like a cage constricting her lungs, suffocating her from the inside out. She pushed herself away from the door, her steps unsteady on the thick Persian rug. The room was a testament to her wealth and his title. It was vast, with ceilings so high they seemed to gather shadows. A grand four-poster bed, draped in dark blue velvet, dominated the space. Moonlight streamed through the tall, mullioned windows, painting silver stripes across the floorboards. On any other night, this room was her sanctuary, a quiet haven of order and grace. Tonight it felt like a mausoleum, a cold, ornate tomb for a marriage that had just been publicly pronounced dead. She walked past the fireplace, where the embers glowed like resentful eyes in the darkness. She saw his face in the flames, that charming, thoughtless smile he gave to everyone, the smile he had given her on their wedding day, the smile he now gave to Clara Bellwether. A sound tore from her throat, a ragged gasp that was half sob, half strangled cry. The carefully constructed dam of her composure, which had held firm through the humiliating dinner and the brutal confrontation, finally broke. The grief came not as a gentle sadness, but as a violent, physical wave. It buckled her knees. She stumbled, catching herself on the edge of a silk-upholstered chaise longue. Her fingers dug into the fabric as the first real sob shook her entire frame. It was an ugly, guttural sound she did not recognize as her own. She collapsed onto the chaise, curling into herself, trying to make her body small, as if she could physically shrink away from the enormity of the pain. The tears were hot and relentless. They streamed down her face, soaking the collar of her expensive gown. She wept for the girl she had been, the hopeful bride who believed in love and honor. She had walked down the aisle toward Alistair, her heart full, believing his title and her fortune would build a dynasty. She had believed in the partnership, in the shared future. What a fool she was, a romantic, trusting fool. She wept for the years she had spent carefully managing the estate's finances, turning her inheritance into a lifeline that kept his profligate lifestyle afloat. She had done it not just out of duty, but out of a desperate, lingering love. She had hoped that by being the perfect duchess, by securing his legacy, she would eventually earn his respect, his loyalty, his affection. Instead, she had only earned his contempt. He saw her not as a partner, but as a resource, an endlessly patient, endlessly forgiving source of funds. Her competence was not a strength to be admired, but a convenience to be exploited. He had taken her love, her loyalty, and her money, and used them to furnish a life for himself that had no room for her. And now he had brought the evidence of his ultimate betrayal into her home, not hidden in some London apartment, not whispered about in secret, but installed in the rooms down the hall. A pregnant, smiling girl who would sleep under Eleanor's roof, eat from her plates, and wear jewels bought with her money. The humiliation was a physical burn, searing through her pride, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, trying to block out the image of Clara's triumphant, blooming radiance and Alistair's protective arm around her. Hours seemed to pass. The sobbing eventually subsided, leaving behind a raw, hollowed-out emptiness. Her body ached. Her throat was sore. The tears had stopped, but the pain remained, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. Slowly, stiffly, she pushed herself up. Her reflection swam into view in the large, gilt-framed mirror hanging over the dressing table. She stared at the woman looking back at her. Her auburn hair had come loose from its elegant chignon, falling in disheveled strands around her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, her skin blotchy. The mask of the serene, untouchable Duchess of Blackwood was gone. In its place was a stranger, a creature of pure misery. And as she looked, a new feeling began to stir beneath the grief. It was not self-pity, it was a glacial, terrifying clarity. She was not looking at a tragic heroine. She was not a noble, suffering wife from a romantic novel. She was looking at a fool, a willing participant in her own destruction. She had known about Alistair's habits for years. the gambling debts she had quietly paid, the whispered rumors of other women she had chosen to ignore. She had told herself it was the way of their world, that men of his station had certain appetites. She had made excuses for him, papered over the cracks in their marriage with her own fortune, all in the name of preserving a dignity that he himself had long since discarded. He had not broken her. She had allowed herself to be broken. She had handed him the hammer and chisel piece by piece over 10 years of marriage. Her compliance was his power. Her silence was his shield. Her money was his weapon, and he had just used it to deliver the final killing blow. The cold stone of pain in her chest began to change. It sharpened, honed by the force of this new, terrible understanding. The grief was burning away, and in its place, something else was being forged. Something hard and unyielding. It was rage, but a rage so pure and so cold, it felt like ice flowing through her veins. He thought she was trapped. He thought her only choices were silent acceptance or scandalous ruin. He had underestimated her. They all had. Eleanor straightened her back. She met the eyes of her reflection, and for the first time saw not the victim, but the survivor. And something more. Something darker. She thought of her father, a man who had built a commercial empire from nothing. He had been a ruthless negotiator, a brilliant strategist who never entered a deal he did not intend to win. He had always told her, "Never let emotion cloud your judgment, Eleanor. See the board, see all the pieces, and never, ever play a game you cannot win." She had inherited his mind, his talent for numbers and strategy, even if she had hidden it behind the facade of a dutiful aristocratic wife. Alistair had forgotten who her father was. He had forgotten that the blood of a titan of industry ran in her veins, not just the pale blue blood of a country aristocrat. She reached up and wiped the last tear from her cheek with the back of her hand. The gesture was not gentle. It was a dismissal, an ending. The time for tears was over. The time for grief was over. She would not mourn the love she had lost, because it had clearly never been real. She would not cry over the humiliation, because she would not be humiliated again. A silent vow formed in the depths of her soul, as solid and unbreakable as diamond. She would not just survive this, she would not just leave him. That would be too easy, too simple. It would leave him free to continue his life with Clara, funded by some other unfortunate soul. No. She would do what her father would have done. She would dismantle him. She would take apart his life piece by piece, until nothing was left but the rubble of his own arrogance. He had built his world on the foundations of her wealth. She would simply pull that foundation out from under him. He had relied on her silence and her fear. She would find a way to use that silence, to turn his own recklessness against him. He wanted her money? He would learn. Now he'll learn, to his eternal regret, what it truly meant to be in debt to Eleanor Ainsworth. A strange calm settled over her. It was not peace, it was the icy serenity of purpose. The chaos of her emotions had coalesced into a single, sharp point of intent. She turned away from the mirror. The disheveled woman was gone, replaced by a resolve that felt more real than any poise she had ever feigned. She walked across the room to the wall and pulled the velvet bell rope. The cord felt cool and smooth in her hand. She gave it a single, decisive tug. She knew her lady's maid Sarah would be asleep at this hour, but she would come. Sarah was loyal. A few moments later, there was a soft knock at the door. "Your Grace?" Sarah's voice was hesitant, filled with concern. "Enter, Sarah," Eleanor said. Her own voice surprised her. It was perfectly level, without a tremor. It was the voice of a woman giving a simple household instruction. The door opened and Sarah slipped inside, her face a mask of worry. She saw Eleanor's state, the rumpled dress, the lingering redness around her eyes, and she took a small step forward. "My lady, are you all right? Shall I fetch you something?" Eleanor held up a hand, stopping her. She did not want pity. She did not want comfort. She wanted action. "I am quite well, thank you, Sarah," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "I require you to do something for me. Please have one of the large travel trunks brought up from storage." Sarah blinked, confused by the request at this late hour. "A trunk, Your Grace? Are we going somewhere?" Eleanor walked to her wardrobe and opened it, looking at the rows of elegant dresses as if she were contemplating an ordinary week. "I am going to London," she announced, her voice as crisp as a winter morning. She looked back at her maid, a faint, unreadable smile on her lips. It did not reach her eyes. "I have decided to do some shopping." The rhythmic clatter of the carriage wheels on the packed dirt road was a steady, unforgiving metronome. Each turn was a tick of a clock counting down, or perhaps counting up. Eleanor sat perfectly still, her back straight against the plush leather seat, a posture drilled into her since childhood. She did not look out the window. The rolling green hills and ancient oaks of the countryside, once a source of deep comfort, now felt like a painted backdrop to a stage she was desperate to burn down. The scent of the worn leather, mixed with the faint, sweet perfume from her gloves, was the only reality. Everything else was a memory she was actively dismantling, piece by painful piece. Her mind was a silent, cold chamber. The storm of tears that had broken her in the privacy of her room had passed. In its wake, it had left not calm, but a terrifying clarity. The humiliation of that dinner, the smug look on Alistair's face, Clara's naive and triumphant gaze. These images no longer brought a fresh wave of grief. Instead, they were like slides under a microscope, specimens to be studied, weaknesses to be cataloged. He thought her weak. He thought her trapped by her title, by her dignity, by her fear of scandal. He had laughed at her. That was his first mistake. He had forgotten who her father was. And he had forgotten that while he had been taught to hunt and ride and charm, she had been taught to count. Her lady's maid, Beatrice, had been surprised by the sudden trip to London. "For shopping, Your Grace?" she had asked, her brow furrowed with concern. Eleanor had simply nodded, her voice even. "Yes, Beatrice. I find I am in need of some new things." The lie was effortless. It slid from her lips as easily as a polite smile at a tedious garden party. But in her heart, she knew the truth. She was not going to London to acquire things, but to acquire power. She was going to purchase the chains that would one day bind her husband. The thought sent a chill down her spine, but it was not a chill of fear. It was the icy thrill of purpose. As the carriage rumbled into the sprawling chaos of London, the atmosphere shifted. The gentle quiet of the countryside was replaced by a cacophony of sounds. The clatter of 1,000 iron-shod wheels on cobblestone, the cries of street vendors, the distant clang of a dockyard bell. People swarmed the streets, a river of humanity that parted for the carriage bearing the Blackwood crest. Eleanor watched them through the window now, their faces a blur of preoccupation and haste. Here she was anonymous. The Duchess of Blackwood was a title, a name on a piece of paper. But Eleanor Ainsworth, daughter of the formidable industrialist and financier Robert Croft, was a force they could not see. Alistair had married her for the Croft fortune. He had never bothered to understand the Croft mine. That was his second mistake. The carriage did not stop in the fashionable districts of Bond Street or Savile Row, where the duchesses of her acquaintance would be browsing silks and ordering gowns. It did not pull up to a grand hotel overlooking a manicured park. Instead, her driver, under instructions given in a low, firm voice, navigated the carriage into the quieter, more sober streets of Mayfair. He stopped before a narrow, unassuming building of dark gray stone. A small, polished brass plaque next to the black lacquered door read, "Sterling and Finch, Solicitors." There were no grand pillars, no gilded lettering. The building's power lay in its discretion. It was a place where fortunes were protected and dynasties were preserved, all behind closed doors. Eleanor stepped out of the carriage without waiting for the footman. She looked up at the tall, dark windows, which reflected the gray sky like sheets of polished steel. This was her father's world. She had been here only a few times as a girl, holding his hand, overwhelmed by the towering shelves of books and the hushed, serious tones of the men in dark suits. Her father had called Mr. Sterling his most trusted guardian. He had said, "Men like the Duke have land, Eleanor. We have ledgers. Never forget that the ledgers are stronger." At the time, she had not understood. Now she understood completely. She walked through the door and the noise of the city vanished. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of old paper, lemon polish, and the faint, dry scent of leather-bound books. The only sound was the deep, sonorous tick of a grandfather clock in the corner. its pendulum swinging with the slow, deliberate certainty of the law itself. A young clerk with a pale face and ink-stained fingers looked up from his desk, his eyes widening in surprise at the sight of her. He began to stand, stammering a greeting. "The Duchess of Blackwood," he managed, his voice a squeak. Eleanor did not smile. She did not offer a pleasantry. She looked past him as if he were a piece of furniture. "Inform Mr. Sterling that I am here," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the silence of the office with the precision of a scalpel. "I do not have an appointment, but he will see me." The clerk scurried away like a fly-bitten mouse, disappearing through a heavy mahogany door. Eleanor was left alone in the waiting area. She did not sit. She stood by the grandfather clock, her gloved fingers resting lightly on its polished case. She felt the slow, steady vibration of its mechanism through the wood. Tick, tock. A future being measured out. A debt coming due. She looked at the rows upon rows of books lining the walls. They were not stories, they were records. Wills, contracts, deeds, trusts. The architecture of wealth and obligation, written in ink and sealed with wax. This was real power, not the hollow pomp of a ducal title, but the cold, hard fact of ownership. The mahogany door opened again. An older man stood in the doorway. Thomas Sterling was in his late 50s, dressed in a perfectly tailored but sober dark suit. His hair was more gray than black, neatly parted. His face was unlined by frivolity, but etched with the faint marks of intense concentration. Behind a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, his eyes were sharp, intelligent, and missed nothing. He had served her father for 20 years and had managed her own trust since her marriage. He was the keeper of her financial independence, the wall that Alistair had never been able to breach. "Your Grace," he said, his voice quiet and formal. He gave a slight, respectful bow. "This is an unexpected honor. Please come in." Eleanor inclined her head and swept past him into his private office. It was much like the waiting room, only larger and more densely packed with the artifacts of his trade. A massive desk of dark wood dominated the space, its surface clear, except for a single neat stack of papers and a heavy inkwell. The air smelled even more strongly of books and beeswax. A small fire crackled quietly in the hearth, taking the edge off the London chill. It offered warmth, but the room itself felt anything but cozy. It was a command center. Mr. Sterling closed the door behind them, the latch clicking shut with a heavy final sound. "May I offer you some tea? Or perhaps something stronger?" he asked, his tone one of polite concern. He saw the faint dark circles under her eyes, the rigid set of her jaw. "No, thank you, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor replied, turning to face him. She pulled off her gloves, one finger at a time, and placed them on the corner of his desk. The simple, deliberate action was a declaration. The niceties were over. "I have not come to London for social reasons. I am here because I require your services." He met her gaze, his own expression becoming more focused, his professional mask settling firmly into place. He had seen this look before in her father's eyes, a look that preceded a decisive, often ruthless business move. To see it now on the face of the Duchess, whom he had always known as a poised and gentle woman, was startling. "Of course, Your Grace. My firm is, as always, entirely at your disposal. How may I assist you?" Eleanor did not sit in the chair he gestured towards. She preferred to stand. It gave her a sense of control she desperately needed. She looked him directly in the eye, her green eyes cold as chips of ice. "I believe you are aware of the terms of my marriage settlement." "I am," he confirmed. "I drafted them with your father. Your inheritance is held in a trust, entirely separate from the Duke's estate. He has no legal claim to the principal. He cannot use it as collateral. It is yours and yours alone." "Precisely," Eleanor said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, yet losing none of its intensity. "Alistair seems to have forgotten that. Or more accurately, he has come to see my fortune as a safety net he can bounce on indefinitely." She paused, letting the silence stretch. "He has brought his mistress to live at Blackwood Manor." Mr. Sterling's face remained impassive, but a flicker of something, perhaps shock or dismay, crossed his eyes before he could suppress it. He had heard rumors, of course. The Duke's spending habits and indiscretions were the subject of quiet gossip all over the city. But to install a mistress in the family seat, under the same roof as the Duchess, was an insult of a different magnitude. It was a public declaration of war. "I see," he said softly. His voice was neutral, but his gaze was filled with a deep, unspoken sympathy. Eleanor raised a hand, a small, sharp gesture that cut him off. "I do not need condolences, Mr. Sterling. He has made his position clear. Now I shall make mine." She took a steadying breath, the air in the quiet room feeling thick in her lungs. "He believes me to be trapped. He believes my only options are to endure the humiliation in silence or to cause a public scandal that would tarnish us both. He is mistaken." She moved closer to the desk, her reflection a pale shadow on its polished surface. "Alistair is a profligate. He spends money he does not have on things he does not need to impress people he does not like. This is not news to you. The Duke's expenditures have long been a matter of concern," Sterling said, choosing his words with diplomatic care. "Concern is no longer a strong enough word," Eleanor countered, her voice hard. "I want to know the exact scale of the disaster. I want a complete and confidential dossier of every single debt my husband has accrued. I want to know every creditor, from the most respectable bank to the most disreputable moneylender. I want to know every gambling marker he has signed in every club in London. I want to know every promissory note he has given for his failed ventures. I want to know the interest rates, the terms, and the due dates. I want a map, Mr. Sterling, a complete map of his financial ruin." The sheer scope of the request hung in the air between them. This was not a wife making a casual inquiry about her husband's finances. This was a general demanding battlefield intelligence. Sterling stared at her, his usual professional calm momentarily broken. He saw her not as a victim seeking aid, but as a strategist preparing for a campaign. He was not being asked to protect her. He was being asked to arm her. His mind worked quickly, processing the implications. To compile such a dossier would require immense discretion and a network of contacts that reached into every corner of the city's financial world, from the boardrooms of high finance to the backrooms of gambling dens. It was a monumental task, and a dangerous one. If the Duke were to learn of it, the consequences would be severe. But Thomas Sterling was not loyal to the Duke. His loyalty was to the Croft family and to the brilliant, fierce man who had been his mentor and patron. He had always respected Eleanor for her grace and intelligence. Now, seeing the steel that had replaced her grief, he felt a new, more profound respect taking root. She was her father's daughter, after all. He pushed his spectacles slightly higher on his nose, a small, habitual gesture that signaled his mind was made up. The flicker of surprise in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cool, focused determination that mirrored her own. "The request is extensive, Your Grace," he said, his voice returning to its usual measured tone. "It will require a great deal of quiet investigation." "I am aware," Eleanor said simply. "That is why I have come to you. My father trusted your discretion above all else. I am doing the same." The mention of her father was the final sealing stroke. It was a reminder of the old allegiance, the foundation upon which their relationship was built. It was a bond far stronger than any marital tie between the Duke and Duchess of Blackwood. "The cost of such an investigation," he began, "not as a deterrent, but as a practical matter, "will be paid from my personal account, not the trust," Eleanor finished for him, anticipating the question. "It will be untraceable. I want no record of this request connecting back to me or to Blackwood Manor. You will act through intermediaries. You will leave no tracks. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," he replied. There was no hesitation in his voice now. He was her man. The task was set. The gears were already turning in his sharp, analytical mind. He began mentally listing the contacts he would need to engage, the quiet inquiries he would need to make. Eleanor gave a single, sharp nod, a gesture of dismissal. The meeting was over. She had said what she came to say. She picked up her gloves from the desk, her movements once again fluid and graceful. The cold, calculating strategist retreated, and the poised Duchess of Blackwood reappeared. The transformation was so seamless, it was almost frightening. As she began to pull on her gloves, she paused. "He has a child on the way," Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice soft again, but with an edge like broken glass. He believes this child will secure his future. He believes it will be his heir, inheriting a great name and a great estate. I need you to provide me with the tools to ensure that child inherits nothing but dust. Mr. Sterling looked at her, at the composed, elegant woman standing before him, speaking of absolute ruin with such chilling calm. He saw the depth of her pain, not in tears but in the terrifying focus of her resolve. It was not the wild fury of a woman scorned. It was the cold, patient anger of a queen whose kingdom had been threatened. He saw the fight she was preparing for, and he knew with absolute certainty that the Duke of Blackwood had no idea what was about to happen to him. He had mistaken a sleeping lioness for a house cat, and he was about to pay the price. Mr. Sterling nodded gravely, the formal movement of his head a silent pledge of allegiance. "You will have your report within the week, Your Grace," he promised, his voice low and firm. "Absolute discretion is assured." As he watched her turn and walk toward the door, her back ramrod straight, he felt a flicker of something in his own chest. It was not pity, it was a grim, profound admiration. The air in the private viewing room was still and cool, smelling faintly of linseed oil and old polished wood. Eleanor sat on a velvet bench, her back perfectly straight. Outside this quiet sanctuary, the muted sounds of a London art gallery drifted in, the soft scuff of shoes on marble floors and the low murmur of patrons. On the crimson silk walls around her, centuries of serene portraits stared down with placid painted eyes. They were lords and ladies of another time, their faces smooth and untroubled. Eleanor felt a kinship with their silence, with the careful composure they offered the world. Her own composure was a work of art she had been perfecting for years. She had chosen this place for its anonymity and its elegance. It was a world away from the cold formality of a solicitor's office and the oppressive grandeur of Blackwood Manor. Here she was just another wealthy woman contemplating a purchase, a ghost among other ghosts. She smoothed a gloved finger over the grain of the leather portfolio resting beside her. She hadn't opened it yet. She was waiting for Mr. Sterling. The doorman had shown him to the room 10 minutes ago, and he had placed the folder on the bench before retreating to a discreet corner, giving her space. He understood she needed a moment before facing the battlefield he had mapped out for her. Finally, she turned. Mr. Thomas Sterling stood near the door, a silhouette against the light from the main gallery. He was a man made of quiet lines and sober colors, his presence as unobtrusive as a shadow. Yet in his stillness, Eleanor felt an immense and reassuring strength. He was her family's rock, the steward of their fortunes and their secrets for over 2 decades. He had seen her christened, had advised her father, and now he was her only true ally in a war she had not chosen but was determined to win. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was time. Eleanor's heart did not pound. It did not race. Instead, it felt like a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She drew a slow breath, the air tasting of dust and paint, and pulled the folder onto her lap. The leather was supple and dark, the kind of binding reserved for important histories or first editions. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with the ink and paper that chronicled her husband's slow, selfish decay. Her fingers trembled slightly as she untied the simple silk ribbon, holding it closed. For a moment, she saw Alistair's face in her mind, the charming smile he gave to strangers, the condescending curl of his lip he reserved for her. He believed he was the Duke. He believed the title was a shield that made him untouchable. She opened the folder. The first page was a simple summary, typed with Mr. Sterling's trademark precision. It was a list of creditors. There were 12 names. The first few were predictable: Coots Bank, Drummond's, respected institutions that catered to the aristocracy, offering discreet loans against future earnings. Eleanor's eyes scanned the figures, her mind quickly tallying the sums. They were substantial, enough to cause concern for any normal estate, but not enough to cause ruin. Not yet. This was the respectable face of Alistair's debt. This was the part of the story he might even tell his friends, laughing it off as a temporary inconvenience. She turned the page. The names changed. They became less familiar. The letterheads, less ornate. These were private financiers, men who operated in the gray areas of the city, lending money at exorbitant rates to desperate gamblers and reckless dreamers. Men whose methods for collection were likely not as polite as a letter from a bank. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She could picture Alistair, his handsome face flushed with wine and excitement, signing these papers in some smoky, wood-paneled room, believing he was clever, believing he had found a way around the constraints of his reality. He had leveraged the good name of his family, a name that stretched back 400 years, with men who likely had no respect for history at all. Her knuckles were white where she gripped the edge of the page. This was not just mismanagement. This was a profound desecration. Every loan was a nail he had hammered into the coffin of his own legacy. He had taken the honor of the Blackwood Duchy, an honor she had married into and tried to uphold, and sold it piece by piece for fleeting pleasures. He had mortgaged their future for fast horses, for nights at the card table, for expensive trinkets for his mistress. Then came the gambling markers, page after page of them. They were from gentlemen's clubs she had only heard of in whispers, places where fortunes were won and lost on the turn of a single card. The sums were staggering, each one a small fortune in itself. Some were written on club stationery, others scribbled hastily on the back of a dinner menu, signed with Alistair's arrogant, looping signature. She stared at that signature, so full of unearned confidence. He had signed away fields and farms, income from tenants who had worked Blackwood land for generations, all for the thrill of a game he was clearly losing. She felt a wave of nausea, quickly suppressed. This was not the time for emotion. This was the time for assessment. Her inner voice was cold and clear. He did not do this because he was a fool. He did this because he believed he had a safety net. He believed that when the house of cards inevitably fell, her fortune would be there to cushion the blow. He had told her as much himself, his voice dripping with contempt in his study. He saw her not as his wife, but as his bank. A vault he could raid at will to fund his pathetic double life with Clara Bellwether. He thought her love, or her fear of scandal, would be his ultimate protection. He had fundamentally misunderstood her. He had mistaken her patience for weakness, her silence for surrender. She found the section on his failed ventures. Mr. Sterling had been thorough. There was a detailed account of an investment in a new kind of automated loom that had promised to revolutionize the textile industry. It had failed spectacularly, the prototype catching fire and destroying a workshop. There was another, even more absurd scheme involving the import of ice-proof timber from Russia. The ship carrying the entire first shipment had been caught in the Baltic Sea ice and had to dump its cargo to avoid sinking. It was a litany of greed and terrible judgment. Alistair had no head for business, only an appetite for the fantasy of a quick and easy fortune. He wanted the wealth without the work, the victory without the battle. Eleanor paused, her gaze lifting from the pages to one of the portraits on the wall. It was a stern-faced ancestor, the third Duke of Blackwood, a man who had fought alongside his king and had been rewarded with the lands she now called home. His painted eyes seemed to hold a question, a judgment. What have you allowed to happen to our name? Her jaw tightened. I am fixing it, she whispered to the painted Duke, so quietly that the sound was lost in the vast room. She turned to the final page. It was a single sheet of paper. At the top, Mr. Sterling had typed the words, total estimated liabilities. Below it was a number. It was a figure so enormous, so catastrophic, that for a moment Eleanor could not quite comprehend it. It was a sum that the entire Blackwood estate, even running at its most profitable, could not hope to repay in a lifetime. Perhaps not in two. Alistair had not just incurred debt. He had achieved a state of absolute irreversible ruin. He was bankrupt in all but name. The only thing holding his creditors at bay was the fragmented nature of his borrowing. Each lender believed they were one of many, perhaps unaware of the true scale of the problem. They were a pack of wolves circling a wounded animal, but no single wolf had yet dared to move in for the final strike. A strange feeling washed over Eleanor. It was not relief. It was not joy. It was the cold, clarifying calm that comes when the worst is known. The enemy was no longer a shadowy threat. He was here, measured and quantified in black ink on white paper. His every weakness, every desperate act, every foolish hope was contained in the folder on her lap. Alistair thought his power was in his title, in the walls of Blackwood Manor, in the deference of his staff. He was wrong. His power, his freedom, his very existence was now owned by a dozen different men, and she was about to buy them all. She closed her eyes for a single, long moment. The image of Clara Bellwether swam in her mind, her youthful face, her hand resting proudly on her swollen belly. Alistair had brought that woman into their home as the ultimate humiliation. He intended to install his mistress and their child, supported by Eleanor's money, while she, the Duchess, was expected to fade into the background like aging wallpaper. He thought he was demonstrating his power. In reality, he had given Eleanor the one thing she had lacked for years, a reason to stop caring. He had severed the last frayed thread of affection and duty that had bound her to him. He had set her free. She opened her eyes and looked at Mr. Sterling. Her gaze was steady, her face now completely devoid of the shock she had felt moments before. It had been replaced by something harder. Something forged in the fire of her humiliation and cooled into steel. The lawyer met her gaze, his expression unchanging, but she saw a flicker of understanding in his eyes. He saw the shift. He knew the grieving wife was gone, and the strategist had taken her place. "He has leveraged the future income of the estate," she said, her voice low and even. It was not a question, it was a statement. "To the absolute limit, Your Grace," Mr. Sterling confirmed, his own voice a quiet murmur. "For the next 15 years at least. Any income the estate generates is already promised to these men." "And these creditors," Eleanor continued, tapping a finger on the closed folder. "The financiers, the clubs, they are not in communication with one another?" "It is unlikely," he replied. "Each believes they hold a unique and privileged position. A duke's debt is still considered a gentleman's debt. They assume it will be honored. They are unaware that the well they are all drinking from is about to run dry." Eleanor nodded slowly. It was exactly as she had suspected. A scattered, disorganized enemy. Perfect. She could pick them off one by one in silence until she was the only one left standing. She thought of Alistair back at Blackwood, likely enjoying a fine brandy, perhaps laughing with Clara about his wife's sudden interest in London shopping. He would be basking in his perceived victory, blind to the abyss that was opening up beneath his feet. He had spent his life overestimating his own importance and underestimating hers. It was a fatal miscalculation. He had played his hand with flamboyant, reckless arrogance. She was about to play hers with the silent, brutal efficiency of an executioner. The world he had built for himself was an illusion, and she now held the pin to prick the bubble. She stood up, placing the heavy folder back on the velvet bench. The portraits on the wall seemed to watch her, their painted expressions no longer judging, but waiting. She felt a profound sense of purpose, a cold energy that coursed through her veins, chasing away the last vestiges of grief and pain. The woman who had wept in her bedroom just a week ago was a distant memory. That woman was gone, burned away to make room for what was necessary. Eleanor turned to face her solicitor fully. The room was silent, save for the ticking of a distant clock, counting down the final moments of the Duke of Blackwood's reign. Her face was a mask of cold resolve, her green eyes like chips of ice. "I have what I need," she said, her voice clear and without a trace of hesitation. "Now the second phase begins." The silence in the carriage back to Mayfair was a living thing. It was different from the quiet of the art gallery, which had been about absorbing a problem. This was the silence of a decision made. Mr. Sterling sat opposite Eleanor, watching the London streets blur past. He understood the Duchess of Blackwood no longer needed comfort. She needed an arsenal. Eleanor saw her own reflection in the glass, a pale stranger with frighteningly clear eyes. The shame had burned away, leaving something harder, forged in humiliation. This was not a plan for recovery. It was a plan for conquest. They arrived at the offices of Sterling and Finch without a word. The air inside smelled of old paper and beeswax, a scent that once felt reassuring but now felt like a fortress. Mr. Sterling led her not to the client parlor, but to his own private office. It was a room dominated by a vast mahogany desk and floor-to-ceiling bookshelves. A grandfather clock marked the passing seconds with a deep, methodical tick. This was a council of war. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, placing one before her. Eleanor did not touch it. "We must create a new entity," she said, her voice cutting the silence. "A company with no connection to me, my family, or to you." Mr. Sterling leaned forward. "A shell corporation, Duchess, registered offshore. It would make tracing its ownership nearly impossible." She gave a single, sharp nod. "Do it. The name should be forgettable." Her gaze settled on a smooth river stone that served as a paperweight on his desk. "Stone River," she said. "Stone River Holdings." He made a note with a fountain pen. "It is suitably anonymous. I will have the clerks begin the incorporation." "Now," she continued, "we give this ghost its power. You will prepare documents to transfer a sum from my personal trust to the accounts of Stone River Holdings." Mr. Sterling's pen stopped. He lifted his head. "The amount required will be significant, Duchess. The total of the Duke's debts, plus the premium we will need to offer the creditors." Eleanor did not flinch. "My father established that trust to protect me," she said, her voice like ice, "to ensure my security and independence. I can think of no better use for it than to secure my freedom." Her words were absolute. Mr. Sterling held her gaze, then gave a slow, deliberate nod. He pulled formal documents from a drawer. "The authorization will need your signature. The language is standard, but the implications are not. Once transferred, the funds are legally the property of the corporation. The process is irreversible." "I am aware," she said. He slid the document across the polished desk. Eleanor looked at the number written there. It was a sum that could build hospitals or fund universities. For a fleeting second, the scale of it made her breath catch. Was this madness? Then she thought of Alistair's smug smile and Clara's hand resting on her belly in the halls of Blackwood Manor. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, righteous certainty. This was not about money. It was about reclaiming the years he had stolen. She picked up the pen. It felt heavy in her hand like a scepter. Her fingers were steady as she wrote her name. Eleanor Ainsworth. The signature was firm and unwavering. "Good," she said, pushing the document back. "See to it immediately." Eleanor finally reached for the glass of brandy. She took a small sip, the spirit sharp and hot down her throat. It felt like coming back to life. She set the glass down with a soft click. "Now for the final instruction, take that money, go to every name on the list in that folder." She tapped the leather-bound report, the bankers in their fine city offices, the private moneylenders in their smoky back rooms, every last one. "Offer them more than the debt is worth," she continued. 10%, 20 if you must. I want them to be happy to sell. They will not ask who the buyer is. They will be relieved to be free of him," Mr. Sterling confirmed quietly. "Precisely," Eleanor said. She paused, letting her next words fill the room. "Buy every single one of his debts. I want to be his only creditor." A profound silence followed her order. The grandfather clock seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Sterling stared at her, the full, brilliant, and brutal scope of her strategy laid bare. She was not just protecting herself. She was orchestrating a total takeover. She was gathering every chain Alistair had wrapped around himself into her own hands. He would be trapped, completely and utterly. Mr. Sterling let out a slow breath, a flicker of awe in his eyes. He bowed his head slightly. "As you command, Duchess." The days that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. She returned to Blackwood Manor, her secret locked behind a mask of indifference. When she walked its cold halls, she no longer felt like a prisoner. She felt like a surveyor assessing her future property. The priceless paintings and heavy tapestries were no longer symbols of Alistair's heritage. They were assets, collateral. Alistair and Clara were more brazen than ever. He saw his wife's quiet withdrawal as defeat, a melancholy surrender. He grew more confident, more arrogant. He did not know that every bottle of expensive wine he opened that was simply adding to a bill that would soon be presented by an unseen hand. Eleanor watched him, a ghost at her own table, and felt a vast, cold patience. Then, one gray afternoon, a week after her return, a footman entered her sitting room. He carried a silver tray, and upon it was a single crisp envelope, a telegram. Her heart gave a single hard thump against her ribs. Her fingers were not quite steady as she tore it open. The message was brief, coded as they had arranged. It contained only one sentence. The portfolio is complete. You hold all the markers. Eleanor read the words twice. A slow, cold wave of power washed through her. It was done. Every last loan, every gambling debt signed with Alistair's arrogant flourish now belonged to her. The trap was set. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling green lawns. From the terrace below, she could hear Alistair's booming laugh as he told some story to a fawning Clara. They looked so small from up here, so blissfully unaware. She was now their banker, their bookmaker, and their judge, and the time for judgment was drawing near. The carriage wheels crunched on the gravel of Blackwood Manor, the sound unnaturally loud in the still afternoon air. When Eleanor stepped out, the footman who offered his hand almost hesitated. This was not the Duchess who had left for London. The fire in her eyes, the sharp line of her brow, had been replaced by a quiet, unnerving emptiness. She moved like a woman walking in her sleep, her gaze fixed on some point beyond the ancient stone walls of her home. She gave no orders, offered no greeting. She simply glided past the household staff, a phantom in her own house, and ascended the grand staircase without a backward glance. The heavy oak doors to her wing of the manor closed behind her with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a lock turning, though no key was used. For days, that part of the house fell into a deep silence. Eleanor became a ghost, a rumor whispered among the maids. She took her meals in her private sitting room, a tray left untouched outside her door for hours. She was seen only in fleeting glimpses, a pale figure by a window, a silhouette reading in a dim armchair. Her lady's maid, Sarah, a woman who had served her for a decade, found her one afternoon staring at a tapestry. Her hands were idle in her lap, her breathing slow and even. "Your Grace," Sarah began softly, "the sun is lovely today. Perhaps a short walk in the gardens?" Eleanor's eyes drifted from the woven threads of a forgotten battle to Sarah's worried face. "No, thank you, Sarah. I find I have little energy for gardens." Her voice was a monotone, stripped of all warmth or inflection. It was the voice of defeat. Alistair heard the reports of his wife's condition with a surge of triumph. Her retreat was proof of his victory. He had broken her. The powerful, intelligent woman who had once challenged him was now a recluse, lost in her own melancholy. He decided to see it for himself. He strode into her sitting room without knocking, finding her just as Sarah had. She was a portrait of sorrow, framed by the heavy velvet curtains. "Eleanor," he said, his tone laced with false concern, "I hear you are unwell." She looked up, her expression unreadable. "I am tired, Alistair. That is all." He smirked, walking around her chair like a wolf circling its prey. "Melancholy is a fashionable ailment for ladies of your station, but do not let it consume you. The world moves on." He gestured vaguely toward the rest of the house. "Clara and I have decided the south drawing room needs redecorating. The current style is so dreadfully somber." He was testing her, prodding for a reaction. He wanted a flash of anger, a spark of the old defiance. He received nothing. "As you wish, my lord," she murmured, her eyes returning to the wall. "It is your house." He laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound. "Indeed it is. I'm glad you finally remember that." He left, whistling a jaunty tune, the sound echoing down the silent hallway. He felt more the Duke of Blackwood in that moment than he ever had before. He was in control. With Eleanor confined to her rooms, a new energy coursed through the manor. It was a frantic, feverish gaiety, loud and brittle. Alistair and Clara began to entertain, not with the quiet dignity of ducal tradition, but with the reckless abandon of people with something to prove. Crates of French champagne arrived weekly. Florists from London filled the halls with extravagant bouquets that wilted in a day, their sweet, cloying scent a mask for the decay underneath. Parties became a nightly affair. Laughter and music spilled out of the ballroom, echoing across the manicured lawns. Clara, her belly swelling, held court like a queen. She wore new gowns of silk and satin in vibrant, shocking colors, her laughter the loudest in the room. She was living a dream, blinded by the glitter, never once questioning the source of the gold. Alistair adored her performance. He saw her as a reflection of his own power. One evening, standing on the terrace with a glass of brandy, he wrapped his arm around Clara's shoulders. The sounds of a string quartet drifted from the open doors behind them. He pointed with his glass towards the dark, silent windows of Eleanor's wing. "Look at her," he said, his voice thick with contempt. "The Ice Queen in her tower. She thought she could control me with her disapproval, with her money." He took a long drink. "But a man's spirit cannot be caged, Clara. A title like mine finds a way." Clara leaned against him, her youthful face glowing in the moonlight. "She looks so sad all the time," she whispered. "It's a performance," Alistair sneered. "A play for sympathy she will not receive. Her family's money bought her a title, but it couldn't buy her a soul. We have what she never will. Real life. Real passion." He kissed her then, a hungry, possessive kiss meant as much for the unseen audience in the window as for the woman in his arms. Upstairs, Eleanor was not looking out the window. She was not sad. She was working. On the polished, mahogany desk in her study, lit by a single oil lamp, lay a different set of books. Not novels or poetry, but ledgers. They were copies of the Blackwood Estate's official accounts, provided discreetly by a sympathetic estate manager loyal to her family. With meticulous care, she tracked the manor's legitimate income against its expenditures. The numbers told a story far more dramatic than any novel. The estate was bleeding money. For every bottle of champagne Alistair opened, she saw the deficit grow. For every new gown Clara wore, she calculated the debt incurred. She held the telegram from Mr. Sterling in her hand, its single sentence seared into her memory. "The portfolio is complete. You hold all the markers." Every loan, every gambling debt, every promissory note Alistair had ever signed now belonged to her, hidden behind the anonymous facade of a corporation. He thought he was borrowing from a dozen faceless lenders across the country. In truth, he was borrowing from his wife. Every reckless purchase, every extravagant party, was a shovel digging his own grave deeper, and he was borrowing the shovel from her. The muffled laughter from downstairs was not an insult. It was the sound of her plans succeeding. It was the music of his self-destruction. She felt no anger, no jealousy. She felt a profound and chilling calm. She was a scientist observing a predictable chemical reaction. Days turned into weeks. The spending escalated. New horses for the stables, a commission for a new portrait of Clara, plans for a lavish hunting weekend that would host half the county. Alistair was intoxicated with his newfound freedom. His wife's fortune had always been a source of shame for him, a constant reminder of his own inadequacy. Now, by sheer force of will, he felt he had conquered it. His credit, miraculously, seemed endless. When one lender had mysteriously sold his debt, another, more generous one, always seemed to appear. He saw it as a sign of his own importance, his name and title finally commanding the respect he deserved. He never once questioned his good fortune. Eleanor watched it all. She became an expert in patience. She would sit for hours embroidering, the tiny, precise stitches a mirror of her own methodical mind. She was weaving a net. She listened to the household gossip, not for slights, but for information. A new jeweler from London had paid a visit. A wine merchant was boasting of the Duke's enormous new order. Each piece of news was a thread she wove into her tapestry of ruin. Her performance as the broken wife was flawless. She looked paler, thinner. Dark circles appeared under her eyes, a result of long nights spent with the ledgers, not with tears. The staff pitied her. Alistair ignored her. Clara, when their paths occasionally crossed in a hallway, would offer a small, triumphant smile. Eleanor would simply incline her head and glide away, her silence more unnerving than any argument could be. One bright Tuesday afternoon, the final piece fell into place. Eleanor was standing by the tall window of her bedroom, which overlooked the rose garden. The late summer sun warmed the glass. Below, Alistair and Clara were strolling among the blooms. He was beaming, radiating a pride and confidence that was almost manic. Clara was laughing, her hand resting on her stomach. It was an idyllic picture of domestic bliss, a cruel parody of the life Eleanor had once hoped for. But she felt nothing. She was an observer watching the final act of a play she had written herself. Alistair stopped by a fountain. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small, dark velvet box. He presented it to Clara with a theatrical flourish. Clara gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She opened it. Even from her high vantage point, Eleanor saw the flash of light, a cascade of diamonds, brilliant and cold against the afternoon sun. A necklace. It was a spectacular piece, fit for royalty, and wildly beyond the means of the Blackwood estate. Eleanor knew the state of their accounts to the shilling. There was no money for such an ornament. This was not purchased with income. This was purchased with debt. New debt. Debt that would, in a matter of days, find its way into her portfolio. He had just hung another stone around his own neck, and he was smiling as he did it. Eleanor watched as he fastened the necklace around Clara's throat. He kissed her, and she threw her arms around him, her joy echoing faintly up to the silent window. He had done it. He had taken the bait of his own arrogance, swimming ever deeper into the trap. He believed he was free, powerful, the master of his own destiny. He had no idea that the walls were closing in, that the ground beneath his feet was a fiction, and that the only person he truly owed was the forgotten woman watching him from above. A small, cold smile touched Eleanor's lips. It did not reach her eyes. It was a smile of pure glacial satisfaction. The hunt was almost over. From her window, Eleanor watched Alistair gift Clara a diamond necklace she knew the estate cannot afford, and a small, cold smile touched her lips. The game was far from over. In fact, the most important move was about to be made. The silence of her wing of the house was a weapon. While Alistair and Clara filled the halls with laughter and loud music, Eleanor cultivated a quiet so deep it felt like the stillness of the ocean floor. Here, in the calm, she could think. Here, she could plot. Her days were a study in feigned listlessness, but her mind was a whirlwind of activity. She sent a message to Mr. Sterling, requesting another meeting in London. The reason given to the household staff was a necessary visit to a specialist for her nerves. Alistair had laughed when he heard it. Of course, he had said to Clara over breakfast, loud enough for the maids to report back to Eleanor. Her constitution was always fragile. She cannot bear to see me happy. He mistook her silence for weakness, her withdrawal for defeat. It was the most critical mistake he would ever make. The solicitor's office was exactly as she remembered it. The scent of old paper and leather, the quiet tick of the grandfather clock marking time. It was a world away from the cloying sweetness of the dying flowers at Blackwood Manor. Mr. Sterling did not waste time with pleasantries. He had the files ready, his expression grim and professional. "Your Grace," he began, his voice low, "the portfolio is secure. You are the sole proprietor of the Duke's considerable liabilities." Eleanor sat opposite him, her hands folded calmly in her lap. "That was the foundation, Mr. Sterling. Now we build the trap." She leaned forward slightly, her green eyes holding his. "My husband is a man of appetites, for luxury, for praise, and most of all, for easy victory. He despises feeling dependent. He resents my fortune more than he enjoys spending it." Her voice was devoid of emotion, a clinical assessment of a subject she had studied for years. "He needs a grand gesture," she continued, "something that he believes will eclipse my wealth and reestablish his dominance. We are going to give it to him." Mr. Sterling listened, his pen poised over a fresh sheet of paper. "What do you have in mind?" "Something exotic," Eleanor said, a strange light in her eyes. "Something far away, difficult to verify, but with a story that sings of incredible riches. Not stocks or bonds. That is too common, too dry body. It must be something tangible, something you can brag about in a gentleman's club." She paused, her mind's eye picturing Alistair holding court, a cigar in one hand, a brandy in the other. "A mine. A silver mine in South America. Argentina, perhaps. The name must sound solid, respectable. The Cerro de Plata Consolidated Mining Corporation." She had spent nights researching, poring over atlases and old financial journals in her private library. She understood that the most convincing lies are wrapped in layers of truth. We will need geological surveys, fabricated of course, but looking utterly authentic. They should hint at a vein of silver so rich it defies belief, a once-in-a-generation discovery. Mr. Sterling Wortley made meticulous notes. This will require significant resources to create a convincing fiction. We will need to invent a history for this company, establish a phantom office, create correspondence. Do it, Eleanor commanded, and spare no expense. The cost of the bait is nothing compared to the value of the catch. Alistair must believe he is stumbling upon a secret whispered only among the most powerful men. He must feel clever. He must feel chosen. Then she gave him the most crucial part of the instruction. The rumor must not come from a banker or a broker. It must come from someone he considers a peer, but also a rival, someone from his world of cards and horse racing. She described the type of man perfectly. A little reckless, always chasing the next big score, someone Alistair would both envy and feel superior to. Find such a man, someone in need of funds, pay him whatever he asks, he will be our messenger. For a week, silence descended again. Eleanor returned to Blackwood Manor in her role as the melancholic, spectral Duchess. She took her meals in her rooms. She read books in the garden, never acknowledging the laughter that drifted from the terrace where Clara held court with her new friends. Alistair saw her from a distance and felt a surge of triumph. He was winning. He had broken her spirit. He was the master of his own home. His confidence swelled into arrogance. The parties became more frequent, the spending more reckless. He was celebrating his victory before the war was even over. He felt invincible, his title a shield against all consequences. He just needed one more thing, a decisive financial blow that would free him from Eleanor forever. He was tired of her silent judgment, of the fortune that was hers, not his. The seed was planted on a Tuesday night at the Olympian Club, a place thick with cigar smoke and the smell of expensive leather and whiskey. Alistair was there, holding court after a modest win at the card table. He felt expansive, brilliant. He was talking about a new racehorse he planned to buy when a man named Jack Davies slid into the seat beside him. Jack was a familiar face, a baron's second son with a reputation for high stakes and bad luck. Alistair, Jack began, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Good to see you on a winning streak. Alistair gave a magnanimous smile. Fortune favors the bold, Jack. You should try it sometime. Jack leaned closer, his voice a low murmur. Speaking of bold, I heard something not for the faint of heart. He glanced around the room as if worried they would be overheard. This was theater, and he was playing his part perfectly, just as Mr. Sterling had coached him. It's not for men who buy racehorses, it's for men who buy the whole racetrack. Alistair's interest was piqued. He loved the language of exclusivity. What are you talking about? Argentina, Jack whispered, the word itself sounding like an adventure. A silver prospect. I saw a report, Alistair. A private geological survey. They've found a mountain of it. A river of silver just waiting to be pulled from the ground. He made it sound like a holy grail. They're calling it Cerro de Plata. The company is keeping it quiet, of course, only bringing in a few key investors before it goes public and the value explodes. Greed, sharp and potent, coiled in Alistair's gut. This was it. This was the kind of opportunity he had always dreamed of. The stuff of Ladens. It was a gentleman's venture, a conquest, not some grubby stock market trade. Who is behind it? He asked, trying to sound casual. Jack shrugged, a masterful performance of feigned ignorance. Heavy hitters, old money, they don't want small-timers. They need capital, and they need it now, before the word gets out. I'm trying to scrape something together myself, but I'm short. A man like you, though, a man with your resources. He let the sentence hang in the air, a glittering lure. He mentioned a staggering figure, a sum required for a primary stake, and watched Alistair's eyes widen. The hook was set, deeply. Alistair left the club that night in a fever. He could think of nothing else. The silver mine, Cerro de Plata. It sounded like a ducal property already. He saw it all laid out before him. He would invest, the mine would prove to be a colossal success, and he would become wealthier than Eleanor's father had ever been. He would be his own man, a titan of industry. He would finally have the respect he deserved, not just for his title, but for his acumen. his daring. He returned to Blackwood Manor long after midnight, his mind racing. He went not to his own room, but to the suite he had given Clara. She was asleep, the soft curve of her belly visible under the silk sheet. He looked at her and felt a surge of purpose. He was doing this for them, for their child, for the dynasty he would build. Free from the shadow of the Ainsworth's reliance on his wife's mercantile wealth, he gently shook her awake. "Clara, wake up." She stirred, blinking in the dim light. "Alistair? What is it? Is something wrong?" He was beaming, his face illuminated with a manic energy. "Wrong, my dear girl. Everything is finally right. Everything is about to change." He sat on the edge of the bed, his voice a excited rumble. He told her everything. He told her about the mountain of silver in Argentina, about the secret deal, about the chance to get in on the ground floor. He painted a vivid picture of their future. A villa on the Mediterranean, a yacht, endless jewels, a life where they answered to no one. "We will be free, Clara," he said, his eyes shining. "Truly free. No more living in her house, under her roof, with her money hanging over our heads. This will be ours. Everything will be ours." Clara, caught up in his whirlwind of enthusiasm, didn't question a single word. She saw only the powerful, charming Duke she had fallen for, a man on the cusp of a great victory. She threw her arms around his neck. "Oh, Alistair, it's wonderful. I knew you would find a way." He held her tight, feeling like a king. The admiration in her eyes was the fuel he had been starving for. It was so different from the cold, appraising look he had grown used to from Eleanor. "It will take a significant investment," he said, his tone serious now. "A massive loan, but the return will be tenfold, 100-fold." He stood up and began to pace the room, his mind already working. He would have to approach lenders. It would be the largest loan he had ever taken, but it was for a sure thing, a guaranteed triumph. He felt a thrill of pure, unadulterated power. This was his moment. His legend was about to be written. From her own room, down the long, silent corridor, Eleanor heard the muffled sound of his excited voice. She could not make out the words, but she could feel the energy, the arrogant certainty. She had known her husband for more than a decade. She knew his every weakness, his every vanity. She had built this trap just for him, tailored to his exact dimensions. And he was walking into it, not with hesitation, but with a joyful, triumphant stride. She stood and walked to her desk, where a single sealed letter from Mr. Sterling lay. She had read it only once. It confirmed that the man named Jack Davies had performed his task perfectly. The bait was taken. Alistair, exhilarated, tells Clara that this is their chance to finally be free of Eleanor's money and influence, and he begins seeking a massive loan to invest. Alistair Ainsworth walked through the streets of London with the stride of a conqueror. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and damp pavement, but he noticed none of it. In his mind, he was already breathing the clean, crisp air of a victor. The silver mine was not just an investment. It was his declaration of independence, the master stroke that would finally and forever place him beyond Eleanor's silent judgment and her family's suffocating money. He pictured the looks on the faces of his peers when they learned of his coup. The Duke of Blackwood, a financial titan in his own right. His first stop was the venerable banking house of Thompson and Sons. They had handled Ainsworth family affairs for generations. Mr. Henderson, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in an expression of mild disapproval, greeted him with the usual deference. Alistair explained his proposition with theatrical flair, sketching out the immense potential of the South American venture. He spoke of yields and purity, using terms he had memorized from the prospectus. He needed a substantial loan, one that would cement his position as the primary investor. Mr. Henderson listened patiently, his fingertips steepled. When Alistair finished, the banker cleared his throat. "Your Grace," he began, his voice dry as old parchment, "it is a fascinating opportunity." Truly. A long pause stretched the silence in the mahogany-paneled room. However, the board has recently adopted a more conservative strategy regarding overseas mining ventures. The risk profile is simply unfavorable at this time. Alistair stared. Unfavorable? He had been banking on their history, on the weight of his title. Conservative? Alistair scoffed, a smile fixed on his face that did not feel genuine. Fortune favors the bold, Henderson. Surely you know that. Indeed, Your Grace. But the bank's fortune depends on caution, the banker replied smoothly, his eyes not wavering. I am afraid we are unable to extend any further credit at this juncture. The finality in his tone was like a door closing softly but firmly in Alistair's face. He left the bank not with a check, but with a growing knot of irritation in his stomach. The next 2 days were a blur of similar meetings. Each one ended with a polite yet unshakable refusal. The moneylenders who had once eagerly offered him cash at exorbitant rates now looked at him with pity. They spoke of tightened ledgers and called in favors. They claimed their own funds were tied up. One man, a portly fellow named Davies, whom Alistair had won and lost fortunes with at the card table, was almost apologetic. I'm sorry, Duke, Eade said, avoiding eye contact. My hands are tied. My own backers have become quite particular. Every closed door fueled Alistair's frustration until it boiled into a cold rage. He returned to the London townhouse, the air crackling with his fury. Clara, who had been excitedly picking out fabrics for a new nursery, met him in the hall. Did you get it, darling? She asked, her eyes wide with anticipation. They're fools, Alistair spat, throwing his gloves onto a side table. A cabal of short-sighted, timid old men. They can't see a golden goose even when it's standing right in front of them. He began to pace the length of the drawing room, his steps heavy on the Persian rug. They'll regret this. When I'm 10 times richer than all of them combined, they will come crawling back. Clara watched him, her smile faltering. So you couldn't secure the loan? Not yet, he snapped. He hated the flicker of doubt in her eyes. It was a mirror of the look Eleanor sometimes gave him, that quiet, appraising stare that made him feel like a specimen under glass. It's a temporary setback. Someone out there has the vision to see what I see. I just need to find them. He poured himself a large brandy, the amber liquid sloshing in the glass. He was not just frustrated. A cold tendril of fear was beginning to wrap around his heart. The opportunity was slipping away. It was 3 nights later, in the cigar lounge of his club, that the miracle happened. He was nursing a whiskey, glowering at the smoke curling towards the ceiling, when an acquaintance, Lord Harrington, sat down beside him. Harrington was a man who always seemed to know things, a hub of the city's most valuable gossip. After the usual pleasantries, Harrington leaned in conspiratorially. Heard you were looking for a significant line of credit, Blackwood, he murmured, his voice low. Alistair grunted. The whole city seems to have heard, and the whole city seems to have collectively lost its nerve. Harrington smiled. Perhaps you've been knocking on the wrong doors. The old guard is finished. They're too afraid of their own shadows. The real money now is with the new players. He took a slow puff of his cigar. There's a new firm, Argentum Capital. Very discreet, very decisive. They don't care about pedigree. They care about bold ideas. And they have deep pockets. Alistair sat up straight. Argentum Capital. The name sounded powerful, modern. I haven't heard of them. You wouldn't have, Harrington said with a knowing look. They don't advertise. They find their clients. They are looking for men of vision who aren't afraid of risk. For a man like you, with an opportunity like the one I hear you have, they would be the perfect match. Harrington then mentioned the name of a solicitor who acted as their intermediary, a man Alistair had never heard of. It felt exclusive. It felt right. A surge of adrenaline shot through Alistair, chasing away the dread of the past week. This was it. This was his lifeline. The next morning, Alistair met with a solicitor representing Argentum Capital. The office was unimpressive, the man himself bland and bureaucratic, but the efficiency was breathtaking. Alistair laid out his proposal, expecting another lengthy judgmental review. Instead, the man simply listened, made a few notes, and reviewed the prospectus for the silver mine. The amount you require is substantial, the solicitor stated, his tone neutral. The returns will be more than substantial, Alistair countered, his confidence fully restored. This is a guaranteed success. The solicitor nodded slowly. Argentum Capital understands that high risk can yield high rewards. We are prepared to offer you the full amount. Alistair's heart leaped. However, the solicitor continued, given the nature of the venture, the interest rate will be considerable, and the loan will be callable upon 30 days' notice. Alistair barely heard the terms. All he heard was yes. A high interest rate was irrelevant when one was about to become fantastically wealthy. He would pay it back in a month, 2 at the most, and laugh all the way to the bank. That is perfectly acceptable, he said, trying to keep the triumph out of his voice. When can the funds be made available? The paperwork will be drawn up immediately, the man said. Upon your signature, the transfer will be initiated. 2 days later, in a quiet, sunlit office in Mayfair, Eleanor sat opposite Mr. Sterling. The scent of beeswax and old paper was a comforting anchor in the storm of her emotions. Between them on the polished mahogany desk lay a single, thick document. It was the loan agreement between Argentum Capital and Alistair Ainsworth, Duke of Blackwood. Mr. Sterling had walked her through the final details, his voice a calm, steady murmur. The interest rate was punitive. The repayment clauses were ironclad. It was a perfect trap constructed from Alistair's own greed. He accepted the terms without negotiation, Mr. Sterling said, his expression unreadable. He believes he has found a savior. Eleanor looked at the document. At the bottom of the final page was a line for Alistair's signature, already filled in his bold, arrogant script. Beneath it was another line, awaiting the lender's approval. Her approval. She picked up the heavy fountain pen Mr. Sterling had placed beside the document. The nib was gold, the body a deep, lacquered black. It felt cold and heavy in her hand, like a weapon. For a single fleeting moment, a memory surfaced. Alistair years ago on their wedding day. He was smiling at her, his blue eyes so full of what she had believed was love. He had taken her hand, his touch warm and sure, and promised to protect her always. A wave of sorrow, sharp and unexpected, washed over her. It was a ghost of a pain she thought she had buried. She was not just destroying a man who had wronged her, she was erasing the last, faint echo of the man she had once loved. Her fingers tightened on the pen. The memory dissolved, replaced by the image of Clara's swollen belly in her house, replaced by the sound of Alistair's mocking laughter in the dining hall, replaced by the chilling realization that his love had been a performance, and her role had been that of the fool. The sorrow hardened again, not into rage, but into something far colder and stronger. Justice. She dipped the pen into the inkwell. The dark blue liquid coated the golden nib. She thought of the estate, of the generations of Ainsworths who had built it, and of Alistair, who would so carelessly gamble it all away. She thought of her own future, a future she was now seizing with this single deliberate motion. She brought the pen to the paper. The scratch of the nib was the only sound in the room during my final whisper. She wrote her name, Eleanor Ainsworth, not with a flourish, but with a stark, precise clarity. It was done. She had just handed her husband the rope, knowing with absolute certainty that he would use it to hang himself. She pushed the document back across the desk. Her hand was perfectly steady. Initiate the transfer, she said, her voice quiet but firm. Mr. Sterling gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He blotted the signature carefully, his movements methodical. As you wish, Your Grace. His eyes met hers for a brief second, and in them she saw not pity, but a profound and silent respect. That evening, back at Blackwood Manor, the sound of a popping cork echoed from the west wing. Alistair stood by the grand fireplace, a bottle of vintage champagne in his hand. He filled 2 crystal flutes, handing one to a beaming Clara. The funds had arrived in his account that afternoon. Within an hour, he had wired every last shilling to the holding company for the silver mine. He felt electric, reborn. To us, he declared, raising his glass, to a future of our own making. No more scraping by, no more living under her shadow. He looked at Clara, his eyes shining with manic excitement. I told you I would do it. I told you I would find a way. Clara laughed, a giddy, breathless sound. She touched her stomach. Our son will be born into a house that is truly ours, she said, her voice filled with adoration. You are brilliant, Alistair, a true genius. Alistair drank deeply, the expensive champagne tasting like victory itself. He was the master of his own destiny. He had outsmarted them all, the timid bankers, the doubting fools, and most of all his cold, judgmental wife. From her distant room in the east wing, Eleanor might have heard the faint sound of their celebration. She sat by her window, looking out at the darkening grounds of the estate she now effectively owned. She felt no triumph, only a vast, quiet emptiness. The trap was set. The final act had begun. The late autumn sun cast long, weak shadows across the manicured lawns of Blackwood Manor. For 3 weeks, Alistair had walked through these halls, not as a man, but as a titan on the cusp of his triumph. He was buoyant, his voice echoing with a new authority that grated on the old stones of the house. He spoke of commissioning a new wing, of buying a racing yacht, of a winter in Monaco. Clara, her belly swelling under new silk gowns, hung on his every word. She saw him as a financial genius, the visionary who would finally cast off the shadow of his wife's fortune. To her, this was the beginning of their real life, a life built on his success, not Eleanor's inheritance. Alistair believed it too. He had never felt more alive, more himself. Eleanor watched it all from a careful distance. She took her meals in her private sitting room, her silence a constant, unnerving presence in the house. Alistair took it for weakness, a bitter woman's retreat into irrelevance. He would sometimes catch her eye across a long hallway and offer a condescending smile. He saw a ghost, a relic of a past he was about to obliterate with his newfound wealth. Eleanor would simply incline her head, her expression unreadable. Inside, she was a clockmaker, listening to the final, silent ticks before the chime. Every boast he made, every extravagant purchase he promised Clara, was just another turn of the key, tightening the spring of her trap. She felt no excitement, only a cold, patient certainty. The waiting was nearly over. The end began on a Tuesday morning, crisp and deceptively bright. Alistair came down to breakfast late, dressed in a clashing tweed jacket he considered the height of country fashion. He kissed Clara's cheek, his good mood filling the room like an obnoxious perfume. He grabbed the Financial Times from the sideboard, pouring himself a coffee with a flourish. He was scanning the market pages, humming under his breath, when a small headline on page 3 caught his eye. Argentine mining venture collapses. The San Coronado silver concern revealed as grand fraud. The words did not immediately connect. It was just a story, a misfortune for some other fool. He read the first paragraph. Then he read it again. The coffee cup in his hand began to tremble, rattling against its saucer. A dark heat flooded his chest. San Coronado, that was his mine, his investment, his glorious future. The article spoke of shell companies, falsified geological reports, and international warrants for the arrest of its founders. It described the scheme as one of the most audacious frauds in recent memory. Millions had vanished. The investors were left with nothing but worthless paper and shattered hopes. Clara was chattering about a name for the baby, but her voice was a distant buzz. The world had narrowed to the tiny damning print in his hands. "No," he whispered, the sound swallowed by the cavernous room. "No, it's a mistake. Slander." He threw the paper down, the pages scattering across the polished floor. "It's a lie," he said, his voice too loud. "Rivals trying to drive down the price before it booms." Clara looked up, her smile faltering. "Alistair, what is it?" He ignored her, pacing the room like a caged animal. He had to contact his source, the man from the club. He had to get a telegram to the company's office in Buenos Aires. There was an explanation. There had to be. He spent the morning in his study, a whirlwind of frantic activity. He sent 3 telegrams. None were answered. He tried to place a call through the international exchange, but the lines to the listed office were disconnected. By noon, the first wave of panic was giving way to a cold, creeping dread that settled deep in his bones. The afternoon post arrived at 3 o'clock. The butler, oblivious to the storm brewing in his master's study, brought the letters in on a silver tray as he always did. On top was a thin, crisp envelope with an unfamiliar legal heading from a firm of liquidators in London. Alistair's hands shook so badly he tore the paper trying to open it. The letter was brutally concise. It informed him, as a registered investor in the San Coronado silver concern, that the company had been declared insolvent. All assets were frozen pending a fraud investigation. His shares, the document stated with sterile finality, held a value of 0. The paper fluttered from his fingers. He sank into his chair, the leather groaning under his weight. It was real. All of it. The money was gone. Every last penny of the loan that was meant to save him. He stared at the wall, at a portrait of his great-grandfather. A man who had built a shipping empire. The Duke in the painting seemed to look down at him with profound disappointment. The silence in the study was absolute, broken only by the frantic thumping of his own heart. He had not just failed, he had been played for a complete and utter fool. The humiliation was a physical sickness rising in his throat. And then a worse thought followed, a spear of pure ice through his gut. The loan, the enormous, high-interest loan he had taken out. The money was gone, but the debt remained. It was a mountain. As if summoned by his terror, a soft knock came at the door. The butler stood there again, his face impassive. "Another letter for you, Your Grace. It just arrived by special courier." He held out the silver tray. On it lay a single heavy envelope of thick cream paper, sealed with a dark blue wax emblem Alistair did not recognize. It was not a crest of any noble house he knew. It was a simple, stylized S. He took it, his fingers feeling numb and clumsy. The butler withdrew, closing the door softly behind him, leaving Alistair alone with this final piece of his ruin. He stared at the seal for a long moment, a strange sense of doom washing over him. This was it. This was the letter he had been dreading without even knowing it. With a deep, shuddering breath, he broke the seal and unfolded the document inside. It was not a letter but a formal notice of demand. At the top was the name of the lender, a corporation he had never heard of, Sterling Holdings Group. The document was an itemized list of his financial obligations. It began with his old gambling markers, the loans from shadowy financiers, the promissory notes he had signed away in moments of drunken optimism. Each one was listed with cold, numerical precision. He saw debts he had forgotten he even had, a lifetime of recklessness laid bare on a single page. He felt a wave of nausea. They knew everything. But that was not the worst part. At the bottom of the long list was a new entry, dated just a few weeks prior. The loan for the San Coronado mine. The colossal sum he had borrowed was added to the total. His eyes scanned down to the final figure, the grand total of his consolidated debt. The number was breathtaking. It was a figure that could swallow the entire Blackwood estate, its lands, its art, its history, and still not be satisfied. It was a debt from which there was no recovery. And then he read the final sentence, printed in stark, bold letters at the bottom of the page. "Pursuant to the terms of your consolidated loan agreement, we hereby call in all outstanding debts. Payment in full is required within 48 hours. 48 hours. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed the half hour, each tick a hammer blow against his sanity. The sum was impossible. He could not raise 1,000th of it in a year, let alone the full amount in 2 days. This was not a warning. It was a death sentence. His title was meaningless. The manor which he could not sell would be stripped of every valuable object. Every painting, every piece of silver, every acre of tenant farmland would be seized. He would be left with nothing but an empty house and a hollow title. He would be the Duke of Dust. Alistair stared at the demand for a sum so vast it would mean total ruin, his face draining of all color as the scale of the disaster dawned on him. For 48 hours, the silence of Blackwood Manor had been Alistair's tormentor. The demand letter on his desk was a death sentence for his family, a sum that promised utter annihilation. He had sent frantic telegrams to old acquaintances, men who once clapped him on the back in London clubs. The replies were cold and immediate. No one would help. Panic finally clawed through his pride. There was only one person left, a source of funds he had treated with magnificent contempt. Eleanor. He ran from the room like a terrified boy. His polished shoes echoed like shots in the empty marble halls. He did not bother to knock. He threw open the doors to Eleanor's private study, the heavy oak crashing against the wall. Eleanor did not flinch. She sat behind her desk, a book open before her, a single cup of tea steaming at her elbow. She looked up, her green eyes calm, as if she were merely noting a change in the weather. He staggered forward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He threw the crumpled letter onto her desk. It skidded across the polished wood and stopped near her hand. "Eleanor," he choked out, his voice a raw, broken thing. "You must do something. We are ruined." He leaned heavily on the desk, his knuckles white. "They're calling in everything. The new loan, the old debts. They've given me 2 days. Her silence was a physical force pressing down on him. Please, he begged, the word scraping his throat. It was a word he had never used with her in their entire marriage. Think of the name. Think of Blackwood. Everything my family built for 9 generations. We will be thrown out. Can you imagine the humiliation? She listened, her face a placid mask. Inside, her mind was a crystal clear ledger of memories. She saw his dismissive laughter when he told her she was trapped. She remembered the sight of him leading Clara up the grand staircase. He spoke of humiliation, but he understood nothing of the shame he had inflicted upon her. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was demanding a bailout. You have the money, he continued, his voice rising. Your trust, it's separate. You can pay this and make it go away. I've learned my lesson, Eleanor. I swear it. He reached a trembling hand toward her. Eleanor finally moved. Her eyes, cold as winter ice, met his. She ignored his hand. Slowly, she opened a shallow drawer and withdrew a single folded document. Her movements were precise, without hurry. She placed it on the desk, then slid it across the surface toward him. Alistair stared at it, confused. What is this? A flicker of desperate hope ignited in his eyes. Did you already do it? He reached for the document, his hands shaking as he unfolded it. It was not a bank draft. It was a legal document filled with dense formal type. The articles of incorporation for a company. His eyes scanned the header. Sterling Acquisitions Limited. The same name that was on the letter of demand. He still didn't understand. He thought it was some legal document to fight them. His eyes darted down the page, past clauses he couldn't comprehend. And then he saw it. At the bottom of the page was a section for the company's director and sole proprietor. There was only one name listed, one signature, written in elegant, familiar ink. Eleanor Ainsworth, Duchess of Blackwood. The air left his lungs in a silent rush. He looked from the signature to the demand letter. Sterling Acquisitions. The name of her family solicitor was Sterling, the anonymous corporation. The sudden refusal of all his old creditors. The impossible loan that appeared just when he needed it. It was not a series of unfortunate events. It was a campaign. The blood drained from his face. He remembered mocking her sadness, celebrating his freedom while she was forging the chains that now bound him. She had not been grieving. She had been calculating. He had thought he was playing a game with a pawn, only to discover she was the queen controlling the entire board. He looked from the paper to her face, comprehension dawning in his eyes. He saw her then, truly saw her for the first time. Not as his wife, but as the architect of his ruin. His lips parted, but only a whisper of sound escaped. You, he whispered, finally understanding. It was you. The whisper hung between them, sharp as glass. You, it was you. Alistair Ainsworth stood frozen, the papers trembling in his hand. The Duke of Blackwood looked at his wife, and for the first time in years, he truly saw her. She was not the docile woman he knew. She was a stranger. Eleanor gave a slow, deliberate nod. Yes, Alistair, it was me. The last flicker of defiance died in his eyes, replaced by a hollow understanding. He sank into the chair opposite her, the papers falling from his grasp. How, he breathed. How could you? Eleanor leaned forward, her hands clasped on the desk. You ask me how? You brought your shame into my home and expected me to fund it. You laughed at my humiliation. You thought my fortune was your safety net. You were mistaken. It was my weapon. He stared, his mouth opening and closing silently. The charming man who commanded rooms with his presence was gone. In his place was a shell. The debt is real, Alistair. Every penny of it. The gambling markers, the disastrous investments. It all totals a sum that would not just bankrupt the estate, it would erase it. And I, she added softly, am the only creditor. His voice was a raw, pleading rasp. Eleanor, for God's sake, think of the name, the family. I have thought of nothing else, she countered. I am saving it. From you. She slid a new stack of documents across the desk. These papers transfer the complete administrative control of the estate and all its assets to me. You will retain your title, a hollow word you can carry, but the land, the income, this manor, they will all be mine to manage. He flinched as if struck. You want to strip me of everything. I want to give you a choice, she corrected him. Sign these documents, and I will consider the debt settled. You will be given a small allowance, enough to live simply, or you can refuse and face the consequences of the life you have led. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock in the hall. The fight drained out of him, leaving a vast emptiness where his pride had once lived. He reached for the pen. His hands shook as he signed his name over and over again. He was not just signing papers. He was signing away his past, his future, his very identity. When he finished, he let the pen drop from his numb fingers. It is done, he said, his voice a ghost. Eleanor did not move. The ring, she said, her tone quiet but unbreakable. Alistair looked down at his left hand, at the heavy gold signet ring. It had been on a Duke of Blackwood's finger for 300 years. This was the final cut. Slowly he began to work it off his finger. It resisted, clinging to the knuckle. With a final painful tug, it came free. He stared at the pale, naked band of skin it left behind. He placed the ring on the desk. It landed with a soft, heavy thud. You have 2 hours to pack, Eleanor said, her voice flat. A carriage will be waiting. Alistair finally looked up, his eyes vacant. Where will we go? He asked, the question of a child. That, she said, turning toward the door, is no longer my concern. From the window of her bedroom, Eleanor watched them leave. A simple, unadorned carriage stood before the grand entrance. Alistair appeared first, carrying a single leather satchel. He wore a plain traveling coat, and he seemed to have shrunk. Then came Clara. Her vibrant youth was gone, replaced by a puffy, tear-stained sorrow. She clutched a small bag, the reality of her loss dawning in her wide eyes. Alistair took her arm impatiently and guided her toward the carriage. He had to open the door himself. They climbed inside, two small figures disappearing into the shadows. The carriage rumbled down the long drive, kicking up dust and fallen leaves. Eleanor watched until it was just a dark shape in the distance. She watched until it passed through the great iron gates and vanished. The house was silent, completely, profoundly silent. The weight of Alistair's presence, the sound of his careless laughter, it was all gone. There was no elation, no triumph. There was only this vast, echoing quiet. She had won. Eleanor stood alone, the victor in her reclaimed territory. She slowly uncurled her fingers. In the center of her palm lay the ducal signet ring. The snarling wolf seemed to stare up at her from the heavy gold. She closed her fist around it, the cold metal a comfort against her skin.